From Mike Tyson burning through a staggering $400 million fortune, to Evander Holyfield losing his 100-room mega mansion, to Thomas Hearns auctioning his championship belts just to settle IRS debt, retirement has crushed boxing's biggest earners. Keep watching to see the final legend, who went broke after buying a private military tank battalion to guard his estate. Iron Mike, the baddest man on the planet, goes broke. At the peak of his career, Mike Tyson is estimated to have made an astonishing $430 million from fights and endorsement deals, the equivalent of around $700 million in today's money. Read that again, $700 million in today's money, and yet, by the time the dust settled, there was nothing left. Not the mansions, not the cars, not the tigers, not a single dollar of it. The controversial sports star blew through the entirety of his fortune during a jaw-dropping 15-year spending spree, eventually filing for bankruptcy in 2003. The man who once made the entire world hold its breath. The man who became undisputed heavyweight champion of the world at just 20 years old was flat broke before he even officially retired. It's one of the most staggering falls from financial grace in the history of sport, and the story of how it happened is wilder than anything that ever took place inside a boxing ring. At just 20 years old, Tyson made history by becoming the youngest heavyweight champion in 1986. A year later, he made history again by being the first boxer to simultaneously hold 3 belts for his WBA, WBC, and IBF title wins. He continued to rule the world of boxing by becoming the undisputed world heavyweight champion for 3 consecutive years from 1987 to 1990. He was, by any measure, the most dominant heavyweight the sport had ever seen. Fights were won in the first round, sometimes in the first 30 seconds. Opponents didn't just lose, they got destroyed. And with that destruction came the kind of money that rewrites a man's entire understanding of the world. When you grow up with nothing, and Tyson grew up with nothing, suddenly having everything feels like permission to spend it all at once. Born in New York on 30 June 1966, Tyson grew up in impoverished neighborhoods with high crime rates. The troubled teen was frequently arrested for petty crimes and, as a result, was sent to the Tryon School for Boys Reform Facility, where he learned to box. The young Tyson faced yet more tribulations when his mother died when he was just 16 years old. So here's a kid who came from nothing, learned to fight as a survival mechanism, lost his mother before he was old enough to vote, and then, almost overnight, found himself holding hundreds of millions of dollars and surrounded by people who were very happy to help him spend it. That's not just a recipe for financial disaster. That's a ticking bomb with a very short fuse. Tyson admitted that his desire for all things luxury came from his poverty-driven childhood. He shared, "That stems pretty much from me being poor and never having anything. From me being bitter, angry, from me being in prison." That honesty from Tyson is important, because it tells you everything about the psychology behind the spending. This wasn't recklessness for the sake of it. This was a man trying to fill a hole that no amount of money was ever going to fill. He bought things because things were proof. Proof that the hungry kid from Brownsville had made it. Proof that the system couldn't touch him anymore. The tragedy is that the spending itself became the system that destroyed him. While Tyson owned several luxury homes at the peak of his success, none was more opulent than his 52-room Connecticut mega mansion. The seriously enviable abode boasted 21 bedrooms, 25 bathrooms, a nightclub, an indoor pool and hot tub, a recording studio, an indoor basketball court, and a cinema room. 21 bedrooms, 25 bathrooms, an indoor nightclub for one man. And that was just one of the properties. He had an Ohio estate as well, with its own basketball court, swimming pool, and most famously, cages for his white Bengal tigers. Tyson reportedly spent $210 on Siberian tigers, $400 on trained pigeons, and $300 on landscaping. The pigeons alone would cost more than most people's first home. But for Tyson, this wasn't extravagance, it was Tuesday. Arguably, the most memorable and extravagant way that Tyson spent his money was on a bathtub. During Tyson's marriage to Robin Givens, he bought her a bathtub made out of 24-karat gold that reportedly cost him $2.2 million. A $2.2 million bathtub. Not a mansion, not a yacht, a bathtub. If there was ever a single purchase that crystallized what was happening to Mike Tyson's fortune, it was that. And understand, this was just one line item in a spending pattern that played out day after day for over a decade. Cars, jewelry, parties, an entourage that numbered in the dozens. Divorce is expensive for anyone. For Tyson, it was catastrophic, but the spending was only part of the story. The other part, perhaps the more devastating part, was what was happening in the background, in the offices and boardrooms and courtrooms where Tyson never set foot. Tyson's career earnings were mishandled by his longtime promoter Don King, who reportedly took a massive cut of his earnings. King's shady contracts and financial manipulation drained Tyson's finances, leading to bitter legal battles. Don King is one of boxing's most controversial figures, a promoter who made an art form out of extracting maximum value from his fighters while leaving them with minimum return. Tyson was, by his own account, one of King's greatest victims. Tyson claimed his promoter Don King robbed him. In 2003, he sued the promoter, but decided to settle out of court for $14 million. $14 million. That settlement sounds like a lot until you remember what Tyson had earned. It was a fraction of what had allegedly been taken. And then there were the legal battles that had nothing to do with King. Tyson's high-profile divorce from actress Robin Givens in 1989 cost him millions. Legal troubles, including a 1992 conviction for rape that led to 3 years in prison, further eroded his wealth. Post-prison, Tyson's comeback bouts generated millions, but weren't enough to cover his mounting debts. 3 years in prison, a career interruption at the absolute prime of his fighting life. And when he came back into a financial structure that was already crumbling, mounting debts, no oversight of his finances, and a lifestyle that had never once been scaled back to match the reality of what was happening. His financial woes included $9 million in a divorce settlement from Monica Turner, who was his second wife, as well as owing over $17 million for unpaid British and US taxes. Add that to the legal fees, the entourage costs, the properties, the tigers, the pigeons, the gold bathtub, and the promoter's cut, and suddenly the $430 million doesn't look nearly as invincible as it once did. By 2003, Tyson's net worth had plummeted from $400 million to being $23 million in debt. Not zero, negative $23 million. He didn't just lose his fortune, he ended up owing more than he had. On declaring bankruptcy, Tyson sold his 52-room Connecticut mega mansion to rapper 50 Cent for $4.4 million, a property that had cost him vastly more to build and maintain. That single transaction tells you everything you need to know about where things stood. During a 2022 appearance on the Pivot podcast, Mike Tyson claimed that he spent the last of his fortune on rehab to battle drug addiction, revealing, "My last $1 million were spent on my rehabilitation because of the approximately $500 million that I made as a boxer. I had nothing left. Nothing. Not a dollar. Not a property. Nothing." A man who had earned the equivalent of a small nation's GDP had arrived at a point where his last remaining money went into a rehabilitation facility just to keep himself alive. That's not a cautionary tale. That's a full collapse of everything. Financial, physical, psychological, all at once. Opening up about his infamous wild spending, he added, "It all went crazy and lasted between 15 and 16 years. It seemed like a lot of money, but eventually it was gone. 15 to 16 years of burning through money faster than even a $430 million fortune could withstand. And the cruelest irony of all, the spending had stopped feeling like spending years before the money ran out. When you're spending millions at that rate, individual purchases stop registering as significant. The numbers just stop meaning anything. That psychological numbing is what drives men from richest on earth to bankruptcy court, not in a single catastrophic decision, but in 1,000 small ones that nobody adds up until it's too late. Although Tyson officially retired from the ring in 2005, the former boxing star has managed to reclaim some of his fortune. Today, he's estimated to be worth $30 million. He's remade his millions thanks to his Tyson Ranch cannabis business, as well as appearances in hit movies such as The Hangover and Rocky Balboa. The comeback has been real, and by any reasonable standard, remarkable. Tyson co-founded Tyson 2.0, a thriving cannabis empire projected to generate over $60 million annually. He found in the end that his name was still worth something, that the legend of Iron Mike could be monetized in ways that didn't require him to take punches. But the road from $430 million to bankruptcy to a cannabis empire is not a road anyone should have to walk. And as we'll see throughout this video, Tyson was far from alone in walking it. The architecture of his destruction, the spending, the predatory management, the legal battles, the divorce costs, the tax debts, would reappear in the stories of almost every other fighter on this list. As if boxing itself were running a script. Champions rise, money flows, the wolves gather, and then the champion retires, and the walls close in. Mike Tyson was the most extreme version of this story, but the story itself, it's as old as the sport. And the next man on our list proves that the pattern goes all the way back to the very beginning of the modern boxing era, to a man who was, in many ways, the greatest heavyweight who ever lived, and who ended up standing at a casino door greeting strangers for a living. Part 2, the Brown Bomber and the baddest tax debt in history. Joe Louis was arguably the greatest boxer of all time, holding the heavyweight championship for an unprecedented 12 years. From 1937 to 1949, 25 successful title defenses, a 66-3 record, a 12-year reign that no other heavyweight champion in history has come close to matching. Joe Louis didn't just win fights, he defined what it meant to be a heavyweight champion. In the late 1930s and throughout the 1940s, he was arguably the most famous athlete in the world, a symbol of American strength at a time when the country desperately needed symbols like that. He knocked out Max Schmeling in the first round in 1938, a fight that carried the weight of geopolitics, of fascism versus democracy, of a nation's pride compressed into two human fists. And he won. He always won. Until the one opponent that no punch could touch. Joe Louis's hardest fight was not with Max Schmeling or Rocky Marciano, but with the Internal Revenue Service. That line, when you understand the full context of what Louis went through, is one of the saddest sentences in the history of sport, because the IRS didn't just take Louis's money, it took his dignity, his retirement, and his peace of mind. It chased him through the last 3 decades of his life with a relentlessness that made even his toughest ring opponents seem merciful by comparison. And the worst part, much of what happened to Louis wasn't even entirely his fault. He was a generous man, a patriotic man, and the victim of a tax system that was specifically structured in a way that made it almost impossible for a high earner in his era to come out clean. When he earned over $371, zero in his first 2 years as a professional boxer, Louis immediately helped family and friends all over the country. For example, he voluntarily paid back to the government welfare payments his stepfather had received during the Great Depression. That detail alone tells you who Joe Louis was, before he'd even established himself as a major champion. Before the big purses started rolling in, he was already paying back money his stepfather had received from the government during the worst economic crisis in American history. He felt that obligation. He honored it. And in doing so, he set a pattern of financial giving to family, to friends, to his country, that would ultimately contribute to his financial ruin. Worse for Joe Louis was the steep tax levied on high incomes. From 1931, his first year in boxing, to 1937, when he knocked out Braddock, the top marginal tax rate had soared from 24% to 79%. 79%. And it was about to get worse. During the 1940s, the top marginal rate was hiked to 90%, and Joe Louis found himself over $500, zero in debt to the IRS in back taxes. 90%. Think about what that means for a fighter earning his living through physical combat. For every dollar Louis made in the ring, he was legally expected to hand 90 cents back to the government. And Louis, unlike later successful athletes, had no tax shelters, municipal bonds, or clever accountants. The wealthy industrialists and business dynasties of the era had armies of lawyers finding creative ways around those rates. Louis had nothing. He just fought, he just earned, and he just got taxed into oblivion. But even that might have been survivable with the right management. The problem was that Louis's management was actively contributing to the problem. His finances were being handled by his promoter's personal accountant at one point. Louis's management team negotiated a deal with the IRS, forcing him out of retirement to pay back money that he didn't remember earning. Money he didn't remember earning. That's not a technicality. That's a man telling you plainly that the people entrusted to handle his business were routing his income in ways he had no knowledge of. and that when the bill came due, it was his name on the debt. He bore the consequences of other people's decisions without ever having been part of making those decisions. That's as clean a definition of financial exploitation as you'll ever find. The IRS chased him. And so Louis had to return to his old life. One assessment had Louis owing a reported $1,250, half of it in unpaid taxes. With unpaid interest too, it would go much higher. And higher it went. The interest payments were compounded each year, ballooning his debt into 7 figures during the 1950s. Compounding interest on a tax debt is one of the most insidious financial traps imaginable. You can't outpace it. Every day you don't pay, the debt grows. And Louis was trying to pay it off by doing the one thing he knew how to do, boxing, at a time when he was well past his prime, and the purses were nothing like they'd been during his championship years. Louis retired in 1949, undefeated as a champion, but now he had to fight again. "I had to keep working to pay taxes," Louis said, "but the more I worked, the less I had." In 1950, Louis announced that he'd decided to come out of retirement and challenge Ezzard Charles for the championship. The reason? Taxes. He lost that fight. He was older, slower, and the championship he'd held for 12 years now belonged to someone else. But losing didn't matter. The taxman didn't care about the result, only the purse. And the purse was never enough. At the time, the tax rate had soared to 91%, so Louis netted very little from these fights, leaving him almost nothing to chip away at the tax debt. Then came the fight that everyone who loves boxing wishes they could erase from history. The next year, for a $300 zero purse, the 37-year-old Louis fought Rocky Marciano, but was knocked out in the 8th round. Marciano, 9 years younger, faster, hitting with the force of a wrecking ball, didn't want to fight Louis. Rocky said that Joe was the last man on earth he wanted to fight. But boxing doesn't do sentiment. The contracts were signed, the lights went on, and in the 8th round, in Madison Square Garden, Joe Louis, the greatest heavyweight champion who ever lived, was knocked through the ropes by a man who'd grown up worshiping him. It has been reported Marciano wept in his dressing room. He said to Louis, "I'm sorry, Joe." Joe responded, "What's the use of crying? The better man won. I guess everything happens for the best." That exchange, Marciano weeping, Louis consoling him, is one of the most human moments in all of sports history. And it sits inside a story of such profound injustice that it's difficult to read without genuine anger. Here was a man who had served his country, who had voluntarily donated his purses to military charities during wartime, who had helped his family and community at every turn, and the government of that same country was forcing him, at 37, past his prime, with knees that ached and reflexes that had slowed, back into a boxing ring so he could hand the money straight over to them. Incredibly, the IRS taxed him for the full amounts on both charity purses from World War II. He fought for the Navy Benevolent Fund and the Army Relief Fund, kept $1 each time, and the IRS still came after him for the full amount as if he'd pocketed it all. That's not taxation. That's something far darker. After retiring with a stellar 66-3 record, Louis was forced into humiliating jobs like professional wrestling and cigarette promotion just to make ends meet. Things only got worse. From 1970 until he died in 1981, Louis was reduced to greeting slot machine players and other gamblers at the front door of Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. The heavyweight champion of the world. The man who knocked Max Schmeling out in the first round. Standing at a casino entrance greeting gamblers. Former opponent Max Schmeling helped pay for his funeral after Louis found himself in more financial trouble because of a drug addiction. He also spent several months in a psychiatric hospital in 1970. Max Schmeling, the man Joe Louis knocked out in the first round, the man who had once been used as a symbol by the Nazi propaganda machine. The symmetry of that fact is almost too painful to sit with. Louis had given so much to his country. He'd served. He'd fought for free. He'd been a symbol of everything America claimed to stand for. And when he died, the man who covered the funeral costs was a German. Louis was buried in Arlington National Cemetery, a fitting tribute to a man who gave so much to his country. The full weight of that tribute, Arlington, that hallowed ground, sits in brutal contrast to the last decade of his life, spent fighting a debt that never went away and standing at a casino door. Joe Louis deserved better. He deserved far better. And the sport he gave his life to had no mechanism to give it to him. Perhaps one of the reasons boxing produces so many financial casualties is because there's no players' union in the sport and pension plans aren't available to most participants. For Louis, there was nothing. No union protection, no pension, no financial safety net of any kind. Just the ring, the purse, and the taxman waiting outside. The story of Joe Louis is the oldest version of a story that boxing would tell again and again, in different voices and different cities, across different generations, but always with the same ending. The bell rings, the money flows, and then one day the money is gone, and the man is left to figure out what comes next, usually with no tools to do it. Louis's story set the template. What came next was simply variations on the same devastating theme. Part 3. The real deal gets the raw deal. Evander Holyfield's unraveling. Evander Holyfield is one of only 2 men, alongside Oleksandr Usyk, to become undisputed world champion in both the heavyweight and cruiserweight divisions. That's the rarefied air Holyfield occupied. 2 divisions, undisputed in both. He beat George Foreman, he beat Mike Tyson twice, he beat Lennox Lewis, then brawled with him in 2 of the most compelling heavyweight fights of the 1990s. His fights generated more than $500 million in pay-per-view sales. Only Oscar de la Hoya and Tyson brought more bank. He was, for a decade, one of the 3 biggest draws in the history of the sport. The money was extraordinary. The crowds were enormous. And through it all, Evander Holyfield, the real deal, carried himself with a quiet grace that set him apart from almost every other fighter of his era. The 4-time heavyweight champion earned over $230 million throughout his boxing career, yet filed for bankruptcy in 2012. Today, his net worth sits at approximately $1 million to $2 million, a staggering drop that raises important questions about wealth management and life after sports. $230 million, down to between $1 and $2 million. That's a loss of over 99% of his career earnings. You could study financial mismanagement as an academic discipline for a decade and struggle to come up with a more complete wipeout. And the way it happened, the specific mechanisms that took $230 million and turned it into nothing, is a masterclass in how the forces arrayed against boxing champions are not just financial, but also deeply personal and systemic. Start with the mansion. His most famous expense was his 54,000-square-foot mansion in Fayetteville, Georgia. The estate featured 109 rooms, including 17 bathrooms, 3 kitchens, a bowling alley, a theater, and an Olympic-sized swimming pool. The property required approximately $1 million annually just for maintenance, utilities, and staff salaries. $1 million a year just to maintain. Not the mortgage, not the purchase price, just the annual cost of keeping the lights on and the staff paid. That's $1,000 a day, every single day, just to sustain a building. The mansion's electricity bill reportedly came to $16,500 per month, $16,500 a month in electricity. The scale of that is almost impossible to process. And here's the most revealing thing about that mansion, the way it came to exist at all. Holyfield has spoken about it openly. Holyfield confessed, "I didn't know what huge was. My whole thing is that they start building it, and I got all this money." He went on to suggest that no one in his family thought of checking how big the home was going to be because he did not ask for a big home. "None of my family members know to a point to and all this, so we have nobody to check to how big, because I didn't tell them I want a big old house." He didn't even ask for a big house. He just let people build one, and nobody said stop. Nobody ran the numbers. Nobody said, "Evander, this is going to cost you $1 million a year just to keep running." He was a man whose whole life had been about controlled aggression inside a ring. And outside that ring, in the world of architects and contractors and financial advisors, he was lost. Unable to keep up the repayments on his 109-room Atlanta mansion, Holyfield was evicted from the property, reportedly owing more than £10 million reportedly owing more than £10 million on mortgage. The largest single-family home in Georgia, a home that had become a symbol of everything he'd achieved, was taken from him. After foreclosure, it was sold at a public auction for $7.5 million. And then, in one of those moments of poetic irony that real life seems to love, the mansion was eventually sold to musician Rick Ross for $5.8 million. And Holyfield moved to a more modest apartment. Rick Ross, a rapper who'd built his entire brand around projecting wealth, bought Evander Holyfield's foreclosed mansion at a fraction of its value. The image of that transaction tells you everything. But the mansion, as catastrophic as it was just one strand of a much wider financial unraveling. Following the defeat to Lewis that saw him lose the world heavyweight title for what would turn out to be the final time in November 1999, Holyfield couldn't seem to catch a break outside the ring. A £2-3 million failed attempt to break into the restaurant business is believed to have been even more costly, with Holyfield losing out on an estimated £76 million. Every failed venture was a new drain on a reservoir that was already dangerously low. The record label, the restaurants, the grill, the barbecue sauce, the fire extinguishers. He launched his own kitchen grill, barbecue sauce, and even a range of fire extinguishers. None returned a profit. And then there were the children. As the father of 11 children with 6 different women, Holyfield needed to make money to cover his vast child support bill. 11 children, 6 mothers. The child support obligations alone would be staggering for any man. But for Holyfield, whose earning power was declining sharply as his boxing career wound down, they became another weight pressing down on already broken finances. Court documents say a boxer who earned roughly $230 million was hundreds of thousands behind on child support payments he may never make. Hundreds of thousands behind. A man who had once earned $34 million for a single fight, the famous bite fight, when Tyson gnawed off a chunk of his ear, was now struggling to make monthly child support payments. Holyfield has likely made hundreds of millions of dollars during his 24-year boxing career, including a reported $34 million for his second bout with Tyson in 1997. The infamous bite fight that ended with Tyson being disqualified for gnawing off a chunk of Holyfield's ear. At the time, it was the richest fight in boxing history. The richest fight in boxing history. The fight where Tyson bit his ear off. And even after that, after the madness of that night, after the $34 million, after all the other enormous paydays, Holyfield ended up in bankruptcy. According to The Independent, Holyfield was declared bankrupt in 2012. As a result, the boxer was said to have been forced to sell everything but his soul at an auction in Beverly Hills. The sale was believed to have been the largest auction of sporting memorabilia by a single person at the time. Sell everything but his soul. That phrase, reported at the time, deserves to land. The largest individual sporting memorabilia auction in history. And it was a forced sale. Championship belts, gloves, trophies, memories, all auctioned off to pay debts. His dire financial situation forced Holyfield to fight on well past his 48th birthday. Like Louis before him, Holyfield was still getting into boxing rings not because he wanted to, but because he had no other way to generate income. While he wasn't the force that he had been earlier in his career, the American used all of his experience to stay competitive in bouts. But the paydays got smaller, the opponents got younger, and the risk of permanent damage grew with every fight he probably shouldn't have taken. Because he was so consumed by boxing, Holyfield never found another life calling that would have allowed him to retire a decade ago, when friends in and out of boxing wanted him to. That observation cuts straight to the heart of what happened to him, and to so many fighters on this list. Boxing doesn't just take the money, it takes the identity. It becomes the whole self. And when the bell stops ringing, when the title fights dry up and the arenas get smaller and the pay-per-view numbers disappear, there's nothing waiting on the other side. No second career, no transition plan, just silence. And bills and a set of skills that have no application anywhere except the ring. Today, financial experts estimate Evander Holyfield's net worth at somewhere between $1 million and $2 million. This modest sum represents a remarkable recovery from bankruptcy, though it's a fraction of what he once possessed. A remarkable recovery from bankruptcy. There's something almost heroic in that framing, and in Holyfield's willingness to keep going, to keep finding ways forward. Outside boxing, Holyfield has contributed to his community through charity work and mentorship. He's involved with youth programs in Atlanta and speaks at schools about perseverance and making smart choices. His willingness to discuss his mistakes publicly has helped other athletes avoid similar pitfalls. He became, in his later years, the warning sign that earlier generations of champions never had. But the warning came too late for him. And as we'll see, it came too late for a lot of others too, including fighters who managed their money reasonably well in the ring, only to have it stripped away from them by forces entirely outside their control. Part 4. Big Daddy, the Hitman, and the ones who hit the hardest, Riddick Bowe, Tommy Hearns, and Dariush Mikeljevski. the consensus heavyweight champion of the world after toppling Evander Holyfield in the first of their trilogy fights in 1992. Riddick Bowe had some $15 million when he initially retired after a rematch with Andrew Golota in 1996. $15 million. Not $400 million like Tyson. Not $230 million like Holyfield. But still $15 million, which, managed with any degree of responsibility, should have been more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life. Bowe was Big Daddy, the heavyweight champion of the world, the man who dethroned Holyfield in one of the decade's great fights, the Brooklyn kid who'd fought his way to the very top of the sport. And at 29 years old with $15 million in the bank, he should have been set. He wasn't. His post-ring career featured an aborted enlistment in the Marines, a prison stay following a chaotic incident with his former wife and 5 children, and, ultimately, a bankruptcy filing. An aborted Marine enlistment. Prison, bankruptcy. That's a particular kind of trajectory. One where the disorientation of retirement from a sport that demands total commitment manifests not just financially, but in a series of increasingly erratic life decisions. Bowe went from fighting for heavyweight championships to trying to enlist in the military at 30, then to prison, then to a courtroom filing for bankruptcy protection. The $15 million, whatever combination of spending, bad decisions, and life chaos that consumed it, was gone. He earned $50 million during his playing career, but his wealth was mismanaged by his advisors. He was reportedly seen trying to sell his own autographed memorabilia at a flea market in New Jersey. A flea market in New Jersey. A former heavyweight champion of the world, sitting at a flea market table, selling his own autographed memorabilia. If you want a single image to represent what happens to these men after the ring, that image from the Bowe story, that humbling, grinding reduction of a heavyweight champion to a flea market stall, is as stark as anything you'll find in the research. He kept trying to come back too. He returned to the ring for 2 wins in 2004-05, then fought once more, beating Jean Pukol by unanimous decision in 2008, but has not returned in spite of repeated rumors. Now consider Tommy Hearns, the Hitman. He held 8 world titles in 6 different divisions, with estimated career earnings of $40 million. 8 world titles, 6 divisions. Thomas Hearns was one of the most technically gifted fighters of his era, a lean, long-armed destroyer who went to war with Marvin Hagler, Sugar Ray Leonard, and Roberto Duran, producing fights that still rank among the greatest ever made. The Detroit boxer, known as the Hitman, had a role in some of history's most lucrative bouts, including losses to Marvin Hagler and Ray Leonard. Even the losses were landmark events. He was a draw even in defeat, which is the highest compliment boxing can give a fighter. Though he made as much as $40 million during his fighting prime, Hearns was under pressure from the IRS within the last several years to pay back about $1 million in taxes and mortgage expenses. He was facing foreclosure proceedings on his home as well, the IRS. Again, the same force that buried Joe Louis, that compounded and never went away. 40 years later, the same institution was going after the Hitman's home. The names change, the decades change, the amounts change. But the IRS is a constant presence in these stories, a kind of permanent shadow over every boxing fortune. In 2010, Hearns was forced to auction off many of his possessions to pay tax debts of $250. 0. The man who'd earned $40 million was auctioning his possessions to pay a $250 zero tax bill. The proportion of that, $250, 0 out of $40 million, makes the situation all the more bewildering. Hearns won his last title in 1999 and lost it a year later, then retired until a 2-fight comeback in 2005-06 that resulted in wins over journeymen John Long and Shannon Landberg. Like almost every fighter in this video, he couldn't fully let go. The ring kept calling, and the finances kept demanding. And the combination pulled him back in well past the point where it was good for him. The Hitman story is instructive precisely because it's not as extreme as Tyson's. $40 million is not $400 million. The recklessness, such as it was, operated on a smaller scale, and yet the result was the same. Foreclosure, auctions, the IRS breathing down his neck. It wasn't just wild spending that destroyed these men's fortunes. It was the absence of anyone looking after the fundamentals. Taxes paid, assets protected, income matched against expenditure. And then there's Dariusz Mikuljewski, a name that many casual boxing fans in the English-speaking world might not immediately recognize, but who was a dominant force in European and world boxing for over a decade. A former WBA, WBO and IBF light heavyweight champion and WBO cruiserweight champion. This Polish-German boxer's 2 divorces cost him more than 15 million euros. Mikuljewski earned around 30 million euros in his career, so 2 divorces took more than half his career earnings. Not bad investments, not tax problems, not wild spending. Divorce, 2 of them. He reportedly lost 30 million euros in the days after his career, including a pair of divorces. The Mikuljewski story highlights a dimension of boxing's financial wreckage that gets less attention than the tigers and the mansions, but is arguably just as destructive. Personal relationships, and the legal consequences of those relationships ending badly. These fighters, many of them from difficult backgrounds, many of them with limited education, all of them operating in an environment where their earning power was tied entirely to their physical capacity to withstand punishment, often made personal choices under enormous stress, surrounded by people who had their own financial interests at heart. The marriages, the children, the divorces, these aren't character flaws. They're predictable consequences of a life lived at extreme speed and extreme risk, with no support structure and no one in your corner once the bout is over. The financial concerns spread to his former promotional company, Universum Box Promotion, which filed for bankruptcy in 2012. Other boxers promoted by the organization included heavyweights Vladimir and Vitaly Klitschko and middleweight Felix Sturm. His promotional company went under too. The destruction wasn't contained to his personal finances. It radiated outward, touching the careers and finances of other fighters who'd trusted the same infrastructure. That ripple effect, one man's financial collapse triggering consequences for others, is something you rarely read about in the headlines. But it's a real and common feature of boxing's financial ecosystem. Felix Trinidad of Puerto Rico reportedly went broke in 2014 after one of his business advisors blew $63 million of the boxer's money on government bonds that more or less became worthless. $63 million. Gone? Not spent on tigers or bathtubs. Not blown on parties or entourages. Gone because a business advisor, someone Trinidad had trusted, made catastrophic investment decisions and took $63 million with him. Felix Trinidad turned pro at the age of 17 and retired with a record of 42-3 with 35 KOs in 2008. He's a former welterweight and junior middleweight world champion and a member of the International Boxing Hall of Fame. A Hall of Famer, a man whose career record shows 35 knockouts, a man who won world championships in multiple weight classes and is universally recognized as one of the greatest Puerto Rican fighters who ever lived. Wiped out not by his own extravagance, but by someone else's catastrophic decisions with his money. The weapon that destroys these men doesn't always come from inside. Sometimes it comes from the people they trust most. There's a pattern forming across these stories, and it's not the one the tabloids usually push. Yes, there's excess. Yes, there are the tigers and the bathtubs and the entourages. But look at the root causes across case after case. Predatory management, catastrophic tax exposure, failed businesses pushed on fighters by people they trusted, divorces that would bankrupt anyone, and a sport that provides no union. No pension, no financial education, and no safety net. These are not weak men. These are the hardest men on earth. What happened to them is a structural failure, a failure of the system around them, not simply a failure of personal character. Keep that in mind as we move to the final section, where the fighters who lost everything did so in ways that are perhaps the most heartbreaking of all. Part 5, The Forgotten Ones, Leon Spinks, Iran Barkley, and Wilfredo Benitez. In just his 8th fight as a professional, Leon Spinks took the heavyweight title in a split decision with Muhammad Ali. His 8th fight, Leon Spinks turned professional, and before he'd even had time to establish himself as a significant contender, he was standing across the ring from the most famous athlete in the world, and he won. In February 1978, Leon Spinks beat Muhammad Ali, the 3-time heavyweight champion of the world, the most celebrated boxer in history. The whole world watched. The whole world was astonished. And for one shining moment, Leon Spinks was the heavyweight champion of the earth. The journey from that moment to what came next is one of the most painful trajectories in this entire list. He filed for bankruptcy protection in 1986 from creditors to whom he owed $301, while claiming the $4.5 million he'd earned in the ring had been frittered away to just a $500 wardrobe and a $1.600 per month salary. A $500 wardrobe. A $1.600 a month salary. That's what remained of the $4.5 million career earnings of the man who beat Muhammad Ali. By 1986, 8 years after the greatest triumph of his life, Leon Spinks had essentially nothing. His total remaining assets amounted to less than most people's monthly rent. Leon Spinks earned around $4.5 million during his career. The crowning moment of his career came when he defeated Muhammad Ali in 1978 to win the world heavyweight title. Unfortunately, by the end of the 20th century, he was homeless. He had many run-ins with the law and admits he squandered most of his earnings on drugs. Homeless, the man who beat Muhammad Ali, sleeping on streets or in shelters or wherever a man with nothing finds to rest. This was where the arc of Leon Spinks' life eventually landed. And unlike Tyson, who could fall back on his name and eventually build a cannabis empire, or Holyfield, who could tour the autograph circuit, Spinks, for a long stretch, had nothing to fall back on at all. The money was gone, the title was gone, the career was a distant memory, and the man himself was left navigating the world without a dollar to his name. And then there's Iran Barkley, the Blade. In 1988, Iran Barkley stunned boxing fans everywhere by knocking out Tommy Hearns for the WBC middleweight championship. His victory was named the Upset of the Year by Ring magazine and prompted high-profile bouts against Roberto Duran and James Toney. That knockout of Hearns, a fighter considered one of the most dangerous men in the sport, was one of those moments that stops time. Barkley was a 7-1 underdog. He was supposed to get dismantled. Instead, in the third round, with blood already streaming from cuts around his own eyes, he turned the fight completely and put the hitman on the canvas. The Bronx roared. Ring magazine named it Upset of the Year. Barkley reportedly made $5 million in his fistic exploits. 10 years after Barkley retired, he was broke and homeless. 10 years, 1 decade from hanging up his gloves, from the last of the title fights, the last of the big purses, to living on the streets of New York. He was homeless, sleeping in a subway station while carrying a bag of clothes and the championship belt he won from Hearns. Barkley says he didn't manage his money well. That's how you end up taking care of everybody else but yourself, he says. He also put some of the blame on the advisors around him at the time. Sleeping in a subway station, carrying his championship belt. That image, that single devastating image, says more about what boxing does to its fighters than any statistic or analysis ever could. He was carrying proof that he had once been the best in the world, and the world he was carrying it through was a subway station. Where the money went is a bit of a mystery. Even Barkley seems a bit unsure how it all slipped away. Certainly there was a lavish lifestyle, and there is also evidence that Barkley was a soft touch for people with a sad story. A soft touch. That phrase, understated as it is, describes one of the most common, least discussed ways that boxers lose their money. They came from hard places. Many of them came from communities where need was visible, where people around them were genuinely struggling. And when you suddenly have money, when you are suddenly the neighborhood's success story, saying no to people who ask becomes a kind of betrayal. These men gave to family members, to friends, to anyone who came with a story, because that's what their community expected, and because many of them genuinely wanted to. The generosity wasn't foolishness. It was loyalty, but it had a price. Ring 10 found Barkley and took him in. The board and members helped to get him an apartment, basic furniture, TV, and we made sure he was able to acquire social services, says Matt. He regularly attends our monthly meetings and has great input in all our decisions and conversations. Due to his knowledge and experience with the sport of boxing, we brought him onto the board of directors where he participates in all aspects of Ring 10. Ring 10, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping former boxers who have fallen on hard times found Barkley and pulled him back from the edge. He says many boxers, even the ones who win, end up having to fight financial troubles in the later years of their lives. After you lost the boxing, what you do then? You say, "Where I go, what I do?" You don't have all that around you, he explains. That last line is the most honest thing said by anyone in this entire story. Where I go, what I do. It's a question that nobody in boxing's business structure seemed to have any interest in helping these men answer. And then there is Wilfredo Benitez, El Radar. Wilfredo Benitez of Puerto Rico holds a boxing record that most likely will never be broken, as he won the WBA junior welterweight crown when he was just 17 years old in 1976. El Radar took the title by beating 30-year-old veteran Antonio Cervantes, becoming the youngest world champion in boxing history. 17 years old, the youngest world champion in boxing history, a record that has stood for half a century and shows no sign of being broken. At an age when most kids are worried about high school exams, Wilfred Benitez was already a world champion. Puerto Rico poured into the streets. His name became synonymous with the island's pride. He won championships in 3 weight divisions. Benitez earned millions of dollars as a boxer, $1.2 million alone for fighting Leonard, at the time the biggest purse ever for a non-heavyweight, and even more for Duran and Hearns. 3 world titles, the biggest purse in non-heavyweight history at the time. He was considered, by many serious boxing observers, to be as talented as any fighter of his era. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, after the decline of Muhammad Ali, the welterweight and middleweight divisions were the most glamorous and competitive in boxing. They were dominated by the 4 kings: Roberto Duran, Marvin Hagler, Thomas Hearns, and Sugar Ray Leonard. To many boxing fans, though, Benitez was the 5th king. The 5th king. Imagine what that meant. To be spoken of in the same breath as Leonard and Hagler and Duran and Hearns, those 4 titans of a golden age, as their equal. Benitez earned approximately $6 million during his career and ended up with dementia and being taken care of by his sister. He receives government assistance and donations to get by and spends most of his time in a wheelchair. It's been alleged that Benitez's father mismanaged a lot of his son's money, but the boxer also spent quite a bit of it himself. Dementia, a wheelchair, government assistance. His sister, who works as his caregiver, says Benitez's father mismanaged most of the money his son earned by splurging it on rides, women, and big gifts. So not only did the money run out, but the very person who should have been protecting the interests of a 17-year-old world champion was allegedly the one spending it. Benitez was a child when he started earning his millions. A child with no financial literacy, no legal protection, no independent advisor, and a father who was making decisions that were, by any account, not in his son's interests. His sister Yvonne pays $1,700 a month in rent. She has looked at houses in Joliet, where her daughter lives, but she hasn't found anything affordable. They live on her pension, Wilfred's pension, and Efrain's Social Security benefits. The youngest world champion in boxing history, the 5th king of a golden era, the man Puerto Rico once celebrated in the streets, living on Social Security and a sister's pension, in a rented apartment in Chicago, in a wheelchair, with dementia. Ring 10 sends financial assistance to former ring great Wilfred Benitez, who suffers from dementia and can no longer care for himself. A charity sends money to help him survive. The sport that made him a champion. The sport that put him in that ring at 17 years old and took $6 million of his dollars, offers him nothing. These stories, Leon Spinks sleeping in shelters, Iran Barkley in a subway station with his championship belt, Wilfredo Benitez in a wheelchair on government assistance, don't end with a dramatic comeback or a new business venture. They end with the quiet, grinding reality of what happens when a sport extracts everything from a person and then leaves them with nothing. These weren't men who failed to take their talent seriously. These were men who dedicated their entire existence to a sport that gave them brief, blazing glory and then left them completely unprepared for everything that came after. Boxers aren't the only professional athletes to end up losing their fortunes and health, but they're certainly among the most visible. For some reason, pugilists have a habit of financial and physical difficulty after hanging up their gloves. Perhaps one of the reasons is because there's no players' union in the sport and pension plans aren't available to most participants. No union, no pension, no financial education built into the career structure, no mandatory independent financial advice, no transition program for retirement. You can earn $400 million in the ring and still end up with nothing. And the sport itself bears no responsibility for that outcome. The promoters take their cut. The tax authorities take their share. The managers and advisors and ex-wives and hangers-on all take their piece. And when there's nothing left, when the former champion is standing at a casino entrance or riding a subway with his belt, nobody from the sport's governing structure is required to do a single thing about it. Some of the game's greatest warriors end up broke and in declining health. Iran Barkley, Wilfred Benitez, Smokin' Joe Frazier are just some of the former champions in need. These are not outliers. They are not exceptions. They are, by the evidence of history, the rule. And that, ultimately, is what makes this story so much bigger than any individual fighter. Mike Tyson's story is about spectacle, about the sheer, almost incomprehensible scale of the spending and the fall. Evander Holyfield's story is about the slow, grinding accumulation of financial pressure from every direction at once. Joe Louis's story is about institutional failure, about a tax system that broke a national hero. But Leon Spinks, Iran Barkley, Wilfredo Benitez, their stories are about the boys that boxing chews up and spits out at the bottom. The ones who never had the name recognition to sustain a comeback brand, who never had the cultural cachet to be cast in a Hollywood comedy, who never had the safety net that the very famous, even in bankruptcy, can sometimes find. They had only what the ring gave them. And when the ring was done with them, they had nothing at all. The sport of boxing has produced more champions than any other discipline on earth, and it has abandoned more of them too. References: Mike Tyson blew all his money. Yahoo Finance Hello Magazine. https://ukbotfinance.yahoo.com snooze. Note: Mike Tyson blew millions, 161 million. 300,158 HTML. Mike Tyson's fortune. How he lost $400 million. CEO Today Magazine. https://www.cotodaymagazine.com. Slate 2025 3 Mike Tyson's fortune downfall. How the champ lost $400 million. Mike Tyson net worth 2026. Parade. https://coparade.com/celebrities. Mike Tyson net worth. Mike Tyson lost $400 million. Irish Star. https://www.irishstar.com. Sport boxing. Mike Tyson net worth. Jake Paul 34,008,568. Inside Mike Tyson's fortune. Hello Magazine. https://www.hellomagazine.com/celebrities. 866,684 Inside Mike Tyson fortune from filing for bankruptcy. Net worth. Now, Mike Tyson's net worth after losing fortune. The Things. https://www.thethings.com. Mike Tyson's net worth is low after losing most of his $400 million fortune. What happened? Evander Holyfield went bankrupt. Give Me Sport. https://www.givemesport.com. How Evander Holyfield went bankrupt. Evander Holyfield net worth. The Real Deal's financial journey. Back Insights. https://backinsights.com/Evander Holyfield net worth. Evander Holyfield's 109-room mansion under foreclosure. ESPN. https://www.espn.com. Sports boxing news store story ID equals 3,428,080. Evander Holyfield lost most of his earnings. Market Realist. https://marketrealist.com. How much is Evander Holyfield's net worth in 2023? Evander Holyfield opens up about his mansion. Essentially Sports. https://www.essentiallysports.com/boxing news. Years after suffering $222.5 million loss, Evander Holyfield opens up about how he built his 45,000 SKU paid castle while making brutally honest confession. Evander Holyfield, where how the money went. BoxRec forum. https://boxrec.com/forum. viewtopic.php. Next PHPH 165,678. How the IRS knocked out Joe Louis Jens Heike Zalb Substack, https://genshakasubstack.com Spears, How the ERS Knocked Out Joe Louis vs. the IRS. Mackinac Center, https://www.mackinac.org/v199722. Joe Louis and Rocky Marciano fight. BoxingNewsOnline.net, https://boxingnewsonline.net. A rock in a hard place. The night a reluctant Rocky Marciano sent Joe Louis through the ropes and into retirement before then apologizing. The night Rocky cried boxing over Broadway. https://www.boxingoverbroadway.com / The night Rocky cried. The IRSKO's Joe Louis WBC Boxing. https://www.bcboxing.com's ENSRIRSKO's Joe Louis Final Boxing Match Vibe. https://www.vibe.com Spheres Editorial Joe Louis Final Boxing Match 612,724. 10 big boxing names who went bankrupt. Bleacher Report https://bleacherreport.com's l'articles /1,654,741 to 10 big boxing names who went bankrupt. Mike Tyson and 5 boxers. Bleacher Report https://bleacherreport.com's Lycral articles 712,829 bankrupt Mike Tyson and 4 others from the past 20 years who ended up broke. Top 15 boxers who lost everything. The Sportster. https://www.thesportster.com/entertainment. Top 15 boxers who lost everything. The 10 biggest boxing champs to go broke. Complex. https://www.complex.com Sports. A Ralph Warner. The 10 biggest boxing champs to go broke. 10 boxers that went broke. Richest Lifestyle. https://richestlifestyle.com/10 boxers that went broke. Iran Barkley. Wilfred Benitez. Ring 10 Foundation. https://ring-det-garg are categorized. Vike uncategorized 8 pod page peer. 2 Last Vike The Last Fight of Wilfred Benitez. Chicago Magazine. https://www.chicagomag.com Chicago Magazine, November 2023. The Last Fight of Wilfred Benitez. George Foreman Comeback and Grill Entrepreneur. https://www.entrepreneur.com/leadership-9 Multimillionaires who lost it all but came back 335,042. 5 professional athletes who lost it all. 1 Bridge Wealth. https://www.onebridgewealth.com/blog The Costly Fall of Fame. 5 professional athletes who lost it all, from Mike Tyson to Joe Louis. Champion boxers who went broke. Mike Hell. https://www.mikehell.com Smorsports. From Mike Tyson Joe Louis champion boxers who went broke 27,668.html.